Hey, folks. Today is Tuesday, May 12th, and I'm pre-recording Politics Chat today because I'm booked tonight at the usual time. And there's some things that people really need to hear about that people call my attention to over the last couple of days. But let me start in a place that is not that so much as the main story in the United States, and I would even argue
In my mind,
the globe right now, is that Trump is mentally not okay.
in my
If you are following his postings on social media, which you can do from a couple of
in my mind, I'm
sites that don't involve going to his own social media site, you will
in my mind, I'm gone.
see he's posting most of the night, and the stuff he is posting is lots of it is AI. But there are certain patterns to it that are really quite interesting. And one of those patterns is that last night, for example, he posted many, many, many times referring to the people who looked into the ties between his 26 presidential campaign and Russian operatives as being traitors and calling for their immediate arrest, including former President Barack Obama. This is interesting in a number of ways because the ties between his campaign and Russian operatives are very clear. Even the Republican-dominated Senate Intelligence Committee said that there were ties. And for the first time, I think, in its history, the only time in its history, the Senate Intelligence Committee unanimously agreed on that. So this is actually quite well established, but it's interesting that he is worried about it now. And it may be in part because former director of the FBI, James Comey, is more in the news, and you can see him more frequently than you could before Trump brought him back into popularity by getting his Department of Justice to charge him criminally for posting a photograph of seashells spelling out 8647. It may simply be because he's seeing a lot of him and a lot of other people involved in going after those ties in the news. So he might just simply be reacting to that. But it is also interesting that sort of in the peripheral vision of the United States, at least, should be what's happening in Russia with Russian President Vladimir Putin. This weekend was Russia's May 9th Victory Day, which marked its triumph over Nazi Germany. And it tends to be a really major event in Russia. And Putin had to do such a scaled down parade this year out of concerns about the reach of Ukrainian drones that it really made him look terribly, terribly weak. And as a number of
I'll dream you'd ever lie so fast to hide and slow walk evidence, to say what does not make much sense. Oh, A.G. Palm Bondi, it's time thou didst abscond, though Trump remains quite fondy. Thy shenanigans are dragging on thee.
people who follow Russian politics say there's one thing that any leader, but certainly not a Russian leader, can project: its weakness. And so Rick Wilson, who is a never Trumper, used to be a Republican, had a really interesting piece about Putin over the weekend and about what it looks like to watch Putin's rule start to deteriorate. And this is not to say he's falling tomorrow, but you can see that things are in real trouble in Russia for him. He's losing huge numbers of men in the front lines against Ukraine for his 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Remember that he invaded first in 2014. Now, again, we've got the 2022 invasion, which has now lasted longer than the Soviet war against the Nazis. And the people that he's losing and that front line, he's lost more than 1.2 million Russian soldiers, either to wounds or to death, which means that virtually everybody in Russia knows somebody who has been wounded or killed in that war for very little to show for it. And the economy is also collapsing in Russia. So Rick Wilson had this really interesting piece where he said, when Putin collapses, and he had a number of scenarios for what the interregnum period will be between Putin's collapse and the rise of a new stable government in Russia. But one of the things he points out is that when that sort of iron fist is no longer in the Kremlin, what you will see is different people trying to buy favor with other countries. And one of the things that we can expect to have happen will be the drip, drip, drip of information about the ties of the Trump organization and the Trump family to Russian operatives. And that may also be something that at least is in the back of Trump's mind, because he has watched the fall of Viktor Orban, who was a close Trump ally and a close Putin ally, who was just rejected from the leadership of Hungary by more than 2/3 of the votes of the Hungarian people, in a system that many people thought had been sewn up for Orban. And he is also watching Putin's Victory Day parade sort of crumble, and Putin basically having to go to him and ask Trump to get the Ukrainians to let him have a victory parade. Trump has to see that his strength on the international scale, on the international stage, looks as if it is not in the position that he thought it was going to be when he threw his lot in with with Putin in 2016 by doing things like changing the Republican national platform in favor of Russia away from Ukraine. And, I've written about that a lot. If anybody is interested, when I say this stuff, you can usually search my old writings all for free, either on Substack, or I will say that Google and Facebook are better at searching those documents than Substack is, and put in an unusual words. So if you put something like Republican National Platform 2016 along with my name, that material would come up if you're interested. All right, so the first thing that is really the overarching story here is Trump's mental health. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how that affects us in a minute. But the really big story I wanted to get to today and make sure I paid attention to was something that 3 people have now written to me about. And I thank you, because I confess it had not occurred to me that people were unclear about this. And that is, with all of the stories in the news about the Supreme Court okaying these gerrymanders that get rid of Black majority districts in the American South, and with the idea of the Virginia State Supreme Court overturning the referendum that the Virginia voters passed a few weeks ago, getting rid of the gerrymander that would have flipped a number of seats to Democratic, a lot of people are not sure that they can still vote. And a lot of people have written to me and saying, what does this mean? What does a gerrymander mean? Does it mean that I can't vote? No, it does not. No, it does not. Your vote is still your most important voice. And I would urge you to make sure that you and all your family members are registered, and to check that registration frequently, because a lot of people are getting tossed off those rolls. And I may or may not talk about how and why that's happening today. But let me explain what's going on right now. So the Republican Party, since at least 2010, not more recently, this isn't a new phenomenon, has been doing something called gerrymandering, which is a stupid word. It actually comes from Elbridge Gerry. It's one of those things, that's how you pronounce his name, but they call it gerrymandering, go figure, from Massachusetts in the very early days of the Republic, because he actually opposed gerrymandering, but he put his stamp on it of approval when he was the governor of Massachusetts way, way, way back a million years ago. So it's got that weird name just because it's named for Elbridge Gerry. Like I say, go figure, welcome to English, right? But what it means is that when the state legislature divides up the pieces of the state for the purposes of voting in these cases in voting for the House of Representatives. They gather voters in such a way that it maximizes the chance that voters will be able to put, in this case, Republicans into the House of Representatives. So what they do is called either cracking or packing. And what that means is that if you have, for example, in Memphis, Tennessee, a city that is predominantly Black and predominantly votes Democratic, you break that up and you take what they did in Memphis is they divided Memphis into thirds, and they took that group of Black Americans and they put them together with white suburbs so that there would be more Republican voters than Democratic voters in those districts. And therefore, instead of there being a Democrat representing Tennessee, representing Memphis in the House of Representatives, as there is now, there will be a Republican now. There'll be, it's divided so that instead of there being a Black district, that has been divided, that has been cracked into 3 Republican districts. So those Black voters, those Democratic voters, will not actually be able to elect a Democrat unless something.
I packed 7 days in a carry-on.